Thank you for having me, especially to Kirsten and to Life and everybody who kind of made this happen. And I promise I won't fall asleep in the middle of this. I'm trying not to think about the time that it is in California. And my hope is just that we'll all have something interesting to talk about at dinner after this. I will try not to keep you. And don't be scared, come up front. I promise I won't quiz you about games. Although, does anybody know which game this is from? Yeah, Zelda. Oh yeah, specifically. Lauren knows. Tears of the Kingdom, right? Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom. Great. So I thought I would use this opportunity to do a couple of things. So briefly, I'm going to make my plug for the growing subfield of environmental media studies. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry, I'm going to talk about it. And mostly talk about the digital game industry and the advantages of using an environmental media perspective while doing that. What did I do? Okay, so where I live on the west coast of the US, fires and droughts are an unfortunate but undeniable reminder that media have become more than passive vessels through which we contemplate landscapes and each other. And I have these are my photos actually of these weird iPhone-looking screens at Los Angeles International Airport. And I saw these in January when I was taking a flight to London. And it was right after quite a bit of LA burned in the Paradise Fire and other fires. And these just seem very poorly timed, sort of national park ads about the Santa Monica wilderness and SAP, a German company that deals with infrastructure, digital infrastructure. So, I think the fact that environmental media studies is rapidly expanding right now is maybe proof that we have a lot to gain by broadening our definition of media beyond traditional categories of mass media to include our own bodies, the planet, and even the air we breathe. And for some, this is a gross misuse of the term media, and so we can fight about this maybe in Q&A. But for others, including me, it's a healthy acknowledgement that humans have never stood apart from their environments, that what affects the land and the water and animals and plants will inevitably affect us as well. So my own work has argued that game worlds have much to tell us about ecological relations or the lack thereof. And even beyond games, game logics and software like game engines now structure many of the environments that we see and interact with every day on our smartphones, tablets, television and movie screens, and computer desktops. As games arguably become both more immersive through VR, bigger monitors, haptic sound, whatever, and more extensive through mobile devices, role play, augmented and mixed reality interfaces, and so on, it seems clear that nature as a criterion of evaluation will never become less salient than it is now. Early game scholars wrestled endlessly with the perceived trade-offs between narrative and game mechanics, but I think today's tensions are decidedly less formal and inward-facing and more a product of the messiness of what Haraway has called nature cultures and UC Perica refashioned as media natures. So given that background, my talk today describes a kind of bifurcation that happens within media studies broadly, but also game studies more narrowly, between textual, visual, and content-focused analysis on the one hand, and more industry, labor, and infrastructure-focused analysis on the other. In the game studies world, we could see this in the differences between my own book, Playing Nature, and Benjamin Abraham's more recent Digital Games After Climate Change, which if you've read it, he barely talks about individual games, but he does methodically list the chemical elements involved in game device manufacturing. And this is, of course, something of a false binary, but I myself struggle with these competing allegiances, and I want to make the case for all of us to occasionally swap methods with our colleagues down the hall. And as a case in point today, I'm going to share some pseudo-ethnographic work that I've done, which is not normal for me, and also more conventional interpretive work. And interestingly, both Ben and I were early members of a climate special interest group that was created within the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA. So today, I'm going to spend a chunk of time sharing my experience working with that group, as well as my perspective as a humanities-based games researcher who is increasingly pulled into conversations around design, sustainability, and quantifiable outcomes. Like I've had scientists come up to me and say, I really want to work on some environmental game design, but I will not do it unless you can show me that it will have a measurable impact for the better. So how do you respond to that? So personally, I remain uncomfortable with the language of measurement, but I recognize the need, not just in games, but across all media sectors, to create and consume more mindfully as we cross this halfway mark in 2025 to the mid-21st century. And at stake is this tenuous category of sustainable games, and whether or not sustainable games have to be sustainably developed games. Actually, I don't know if Guy is here, but this is questions to what you were talking about. Thank you. In other words, are games invested in environmental design and storytelling somehow less important than those whose production impacts have been minimized? What if sustainability were better understood not as a development question, but as a player orientation, manifest in the games that we choose and refuse to play? And I'll talk about how members of the Climate SIG marshaled their labor and the language that they used as a way to get at the philosophical and practical questions raised when we treat games as environmentally communicative media. And I do have a kind of a version of some of this research in the volume Eco Games, which came out a couple years ago. So as a quick aside, if you're not really into games, don't worry, you can mentally substitute your own preferred media form in the discussion that follows, because I do think some of these provocations hold true for cinema, social media, machine learning, AI, et cetera. So in 2025 now, right, we're about 2 to 3 decades into the academic study of video games, maybe longer, we could argue about it. But in 2025, the common practice of writing about games, apart from their context of production, seems less and less tenable as we move into the climate-disrupted future. Although my own work has employed textual analysis, guided by insights from environmental science and communication, trying to identify both harmful and beneficial models of ecological relation in games, I would argue that without opening a dialogue with people who are actively creating games, that these methods may at best produce an analytical shift without systemic change. And as Escobar observes in this quote, design is essential to modern life, yet the bulk of what qualifies as design does not take into account negative effects on the biosphere and more than human beings. And he references design theorist Tony Fry when he labels unsustainable design practices as practices of, it's like the microphone knew I was saying defuturing, trying to foreclose it. But a way to define that would be the reckless foreclosure of potential planetary outcomes. So how can scholars help to ensure that game design is not the defuturing kind? And for me, this necessitates parties working outside of their usual comfort zones, so researchers engaging with industry or vice versa, activists and policymakers engaging media makers as critical to changing the environmental status quo. And my case study of the IGDA Climate SIG is one such novel collaboration between academics, developers, and nonprofits. But later I'll mention a few other groups that are also looking to green the game industry from within and without. So in October of 2020, a woman named Paula Esquadra reached out to me in her capacity as the co-chair of a new climate special interest group within the International Game Developers Association. And to my surprise, Esquadra and some of her colleagues at Google's cloud gaming service, Stadia, may it rest in peace, were familiar with playing nature, and they invited me to attend some of the SIG's first meetings. I ended up going to several of these first working sessions that fall, which were aimed at determining the SIG's scope and anticipated outcomes. And in the many meetings that I participated in since those early days, I was often the only academic, though you can see that Ben Abraham was also there at the beginning. Most of the SIG's members, as you would expect, were workers in or around the game industry, from independents and those working in related spaces in the nonprofit sector to employees at large multinational game or technology companies. And you can see here we were brainstorming the sort of hopes we had for the future of the game industry. And they really run the gamut from narratives to policy to labor and collective action. Now, according to the IGDA itself, the organization has over 5,000 dues-paying members, as well as 150 local chapters and global special interest groups. And to give you some sense of how the SIGs function within the IGDA, I should say They are completely voluntary. And right now they're divided into these three categories: advocacy, discipline, and affinity. And the relatively new climate SIG falls into the advocacy group, along with things like game accessibility, LGBTQ plus matters, anti-censorship, mental health, and so on. But by far the greatest number of SIGs occur in the discipline category, which revolves around issues of craft in game form and content. So there are discipline SIGs dedicated to analog games, serious games, audio, localization in the cloud. And finally, the affinity category invites members to affiliate based on shared identity characteristics. So there are SIGs like Black in games, Chinese in games, or devs with kids. Granted, as the climate SIG has expanded its roster and clarified its goals, it's become very clear to me that advocacy inevitably overlaps with affinity groups, and also the design-oriented nature of the disciplinary SIG. So people advocate from a place of shared values, and they're looking to include aspects of those values in their work as game designers. Early on, members of the climate SIG, led by Esquadra and also then co-chair Hugo Billy, who used to work on electronic arts games, they opted to divide and conquer with several work streams. I don't have time to kind of go through all of these, but I'm going to focus on the very last one that is called design patterns. It proved to be one of the most active work streams, maybe because it offered very tangible and manageable ways for the membership to contribute. It was close to their daily concerns, right? How to design games. And so it was geared toward giving developers practical tools and examples to help them infuse sustainability into game design and their business design. And before proceeding, I think we should linger a little bit over this term design patterns. So my academic brain was working furiously during these meetings, right? I kept wondering, what is being designed in these patterns, and if so, by whom? Although Escobar, who I referred to earlier, would have it that everybody designs. Design in its professional manifestations is typically policed by tastemakers and gatekeepers of all kinds. So presumably the climate SIG is addressing its constituency of game developers who engage with game design, and thus the patterns in question are, in some way part of the game development process. However, that still leaves a lot of leeway. So, I'm thinking of things like environmental realism and graphical representation, like more botanically accurate plants, let's say, or realism in game mechanics, like making supplies finite in a game that's based on the extraction of resources. But could these design patterns also include things like procurement strategies for energy used to power the computers on which a game is developed, or a decision to distribute a game via digital download rather than in shrink-wrapped boxes, or even encouraging players to play a game in a low-resolution, power-saving mode when they're on the move or in a distracted state. So maybe we need to break down this idea of design patterns into categories like development patterns or distribution patterns or consumption or player patterns. And I think, we could map this, this quest for the locus of sustainability in games to the three categories of emissions that were specified by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which I'll actually come back to later. So as a participant observer in the climate SIG, it's been really illuminating for me to see how the language of design patterns shifted over time. And I originally gravitated to this work stream because the idea, that was my scope 1, scope 2 diagram, and I'll come back to that. I went to this work stream and volunteered my time in it because it sounded a lot like the way that academics talk about games in terms of discrete and observable gameplay elements. But design patterns could, in theory, occur at scales ranging from individual models or mechanics all the way up to genre and beyond. And of course, if you're in architecture, you might also be thinking of discourses within architectural design, like the pattern language methodology of Christopher Alexander collaborators. But for me, at least, the word patterns also evokes sewing patterns and more craft-oriented design work. This is an important material and feminist trend within critical design studies. And the sweater, by the way, is knitted in Morse code for SOS. So sweater is created by Kristen Herring, and it's called Subtle Distress. So importantly for Escobar, design refers to much more than the creation of objects like toasters or digital devices. Famous buildings, social services, ecologically minded production. What the notion of design signals instead in his work is diverse forms of life and often contrasting notions of sociability in the world. So if we take this concept of design seriously, I think we could say design patterns can and should refer to not just objects or things, like a game file or a device, but also to the relationships they engender and a holistic sense of the world that is brought into being by design. Curiously, however, something about that phrase, design patterns, proved unappealing to the core group of people working in that work stream. It was co-chaired by Hugo Billy and also Arnaud Fayot, who's an art director at Ubisoft. And while I was participating, the terminology gradually shifted toward more action-laden terms. So the design patterns work stream, eventually, it's very hard to see this Discord messiness, but it's got split into 3 interrelated parts. There was a tactics report, an actions wiki, and also a list of games, right? And they were all supposed to interrelate. And then after many months of crowdsourced authorship, editing, and graphic design, the tactics report was released in alpha form in April 2022 as the Environmental Game Design Playbook. This playbook is over 80 pages long. It's very academic leaning, and it details psychological barriers for environmental action, and then the design patterns, right, or tactics that games can use to bypass or break down those barriers. And the primary author of the document was a doctoral student in education at the time. His name is Clayton Whittle. And so the report draws very heavily on the literature on educational and serious games. And what I'm focused on is part 2, that was about tactics, and it was prefaced with the question, how might we make our game impact players in the way we intended? So clearly the report, right, is it meant to be read and used by developers who are short on time, but they're still interested in positive climate action. And then if you look in the table of contents, you'll see that the design patterns, now tactics, are organized into categories ranging from specific to more abstract. There's more, but so I should say part 3 of the playbook is actually reserved for interpersonal and community gameplay tactics, or more social tactics. But each tactic follows the same template. There's a paragraph that describes it, a hypothetical development scenario, reasons why you might want to use it, and then caveats and suggestions for deploying it. And so I won't go into too much detail, but here of no-win scenarios that you could use. So I think the Environmental Game Design Playbook, I'm technically a co-author, even though I was not contributing greatly to the authorship, provides a nominal basis for thinking through systemic change from within the very institutions contributing to technological overwhelm, destruction of habitat, and labor exploitation, even as they also create meaningful and widely shared forms of culture, games, right? But significant challenges remain, not least among them how we define sustainability and the continued tension that I've tried to identify between calls for more environmentally intelligent games and calls for more sustainable production techniques, or what we might call matters of content and context, right? So I dug this up just online from Investopedia, right? Sustainability, this word is really tricky, right? Because it could just as well refer to the ability of the game industry to continue as normal and prolong the status quo, i.e. make enough money, earth be damned, rather than what I would prefer, which is the ability of the biosphere to support media making and consumption. So accordingly, much of my analytical interest in the SIG has been in trying to figure out just where agency lies in this environment and games nexus. So who has the power, or is at least perceived to have the power, to affect change? And the obvious answer, given the umbrella organization of IGDA, is game developers. Yet games researchers, like myself, are also deeply invested in these matters, as well as many players and policymakers. Moreover, game developers are not the only ones who design. So in design, we could include the work of modders, or people who modify games, but also players if design is seen in that more expansive sense as deliberate creative decisions that produce particular worlds and ways of being. So maybe it's just better to think about who has the power to affect change at what level or in what ways. And right now, the Climate SIG is trying its best to be a kind of megaphone aimed at the industry to amplify the concerns of its membership and to search for footholds to shape pro-environmental behavior and attitudes. But it's at the scale of individual developers and corporations. And it's worth noting that the SIG has an ambiguous but sort of mutual relationship to the UN's Playing for the Planet initiative, which was launched back in September 2019. And interestingly, despite the name, it puts the onus of change on companies rather than players. So, I've lost track of how many, this is just a partial listing of companies, but something like 40 member companies who have signed on to the Alliance, from really huge ones like Microsoft and Sony, to smaller studios like Strange Loop Games or Eline Media. And all of them have, quote unquote, made voluntary, ambitious, specific, and time-based commitments for people and planet, right? And so this emphasis on corporate innovation aligns well with Ben Abraham's stance in digital games after climate change. He's very impatient. I can say this because we know each other. He's very impatient with these generalized hopes and fears, right, surrounding what games can do. And he really argues in his book that we're misguided if we believe that games alone could convince climate change deniers to accept that reality, right? Let alone make the world a better place through some kind of wishful osmotic uptake of enlightened game content, right? So, he really sidesteps eco-critical approaches almost entirely in favor of studying game companies that have taken concrete steps to have sustainable operations and advocating that the game industry green its supply chain. So if we went back to that diagram, looking at scope 1 and scope 2, right? Renewable energy and digital distribution and things like that. So there's a strong case to be made, right, for Playing for the Planet and Abraham's insistence on corporate level intervention, right? I'm thinking of, I think you all know this, many scholars in environmental communication who have expressed skepticism over corporate and governmental attempts to displace responsibility, right, environmental responsibility onto us, onto individual consumers, rather than addressing systemic change. And I think there is understandable and widely shared discontent with the limitations of individual choices, right? And a desperate yearning for collective action and system change. And in terms of games research, I myself have found that writing more directly about media infrastructure is somewhat soothing to me and to these worries. So along with this work on the Climate SIG and things like going to the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, I've spent the last 5 years or so writing about things like the carbon footprint of game streaming, about new climatic realities for sports and games, and even things like my current obsession is 3D asset modeling and sort of the generic excesses of 3D asset modeling, particularly of plants. So that said, I still think for a number of reasons that we ought to distribute our hopes for games more broadly. So for one, we've seen that companies like Microsoft and Apple can spin a good yarn about going carbon negative and their corporate philanthropy and their progressive politics and so on, while still working behind the scenes to support lobbyists that are looking to sink environmental and social reform. And the other thing is my colleague Jason Ludwig just wrote this op-ed about AI infrastructure and its huge impact in the form of data centers. So, we need to do careful work to distinguish genuine efforts toward decarbonization from greenwashing. And I'm also not quite ready to give up on players or designers. And, I want to recognize that system change can happen from within or without at various scales and through strong and weak ties. So the ongoing example of the IGDA Climate SIG, I hope, provides rationale for why we ought to support these intersecting roles, right? In their case, they're developers who are also players and activists and concerned citizens. And, interestingly, I think design patterns could expand to include more base level interventions into game design practice that encourage more mindful use of onboard computer or device resources, as well as networked resources. And even though developers are likely to classify these kinds of steps less as design than as optimization or matters of efficiency rather than aesthetics. There are many niche efforts already underway that are linking energy and processing limitations to satisfying design. So let me just give you a few examples. There were retro and 8-bit games, text and tiny game jams. One of my favorite examples is the Small File Media Festival, which started in 2020 at the School for the Contemporary Arts in Vancouver at Simon Fraser. And it specifically, when it started, targeted young filmmakers and kind of called them to arms by saying, please send us videos of under 5 megabytes that show us that movies don't have to be big to be beautiful and inspiring, right? And more recently, the festival has tried to expand to interactive media. And if you go to the website, you can find all sorts of tips or recommendations for making beautiful small media, from compressing your video and audio to embracing a low poly, or meaning low polygon count aesthetic. And in the games world, some artists are already experimenting with this kind of light design. I think of Kara Stone's solar server project. She's at Alberta. And she's basically created this solar-powered web server on her balcony in Alberta, which is dependent on the weather. And it's made to support low-cost carbon video games. I also think of Sunblock One, which is a solar-powered Minecraft server created by Bart Simon and a research group at Concordia. It lives on the roof of a uni building in Montreal. And the group actually created a heads-up display so that players on this server could see in real time the status of the battery, the power draw of the CPU and system, and the power being produced by the solar panel, along with the details and about the time and the weather in Montreal. And so Sunblock One has led to such interesting discoveries as flying in Minecraft takes more energy than walking. So if you have your elytra wings, that takes more energy. And I think Bart, he argues that the server allows players to experience alternative energy infrastructure in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be able to, because you're thinking about things like the weather and your own game actions and the impact that those have on server uptime, literally whether you can continue. And then on the policy side, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I'm also on the advisory board for the 4-year strategies project. It's kind of clunky, but it stands for the Sustainable Transition for Europe's Game Industries. That's really some finessing that's happening with the acronym, but it's funded by the EU and by Innovate UK. It's being run out of multiple academic institutions, including Utrecht University, Manchester Metropolitan, and TH Con. And you can go to the project site to learn about the different work packages. But I do want to point out that one of the deliverables actually just came out on October 7th. That is the Sustainable Game Standard. It was developed as part of the Work Package 3 in partnership with the Sustainable Games Alliance. And this is basically, if you read their site, you can see the standard is a games industry-specific interpretation of the greenhouse gas protocol. And it's meant to cover everything from game design and server infrastructure to marketing and hardware. So this standard, it's clearly there to help game companies navigate EU regulation, right? But it's also, helping to define benchmarks. And if you go back to that ugly chart from before, right, what I find really useful about it is that it's not just talking about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, like direct and sort of related emissions, but also scope 3, which is all that downstream stuff that we typically just leave out of the estimate, right? Like transportation and distribution and user devices, data centers, all that stuff. So it's very exciting to see this kind of work happening. I don't have time to talk about it, but I even stumbled while I was preparing for this talk on a French organization that just popped up called Game Impact. They haven't yet translated their guide into English, so if you want to help, they're looking for help. But if you read it, these kinds of recommendations would be unheard of a decade ago. Gamers would rise up. But they're asking you to do things like promise not to buy stuff you're not going to use, right? Thinking about what is the appropriate resolution for your usage, right? Does your video really have to be streamed in 4K or in HD? So things like this. And I think other tactics, design patterns could include the right to repair, or even more radically, the decision not to play at all. And this is something I tried to get at earlier when I was talking about sustainability as a player orientation. And I think to go back to Ben Abraham, I'm sorry, Ben, wherever you are, I think it's really interesting because he starts his book with this story about growing up in Australia. And during the hot summer days, he had to decide whether he was going to play on his computer. His room was in the upstairs attic. So if he played on his computer, he'd have fun, but he wouldn't be able to sleep because it was so hot. And so he often chose to play anyway, but I think we're both thinking, right, that future temperatures may take that choice out of our hands in the future. All right, and then I was talking to some folks before about how I feel obliged to reveal that I'm a humanist and not a social scientist. And I'm a media scholar now, but a former English professor. And so I have to add this final twist by saying that environmental tactics can and should include the realm of the aesthetic and the interpretive. And so there's still power in paying very close attention to games, whether it's writing about them, teaching them, or playing and discussing them in community. And, we're all tired. It's like 5:30 on the day 2 of the conference. And so I thought, I am going to talk about a game. I'm just going to go deep on a game just for fun. So this is a game I spent way too many hours playing last year. It was developed by a small studio based in Zurich called Stray Fawn. And as their website proclaims, procedural content generation and the simulation of living worlds form the core of the studio's creations. And one of the studio's co-founders, Philomena Schwab, who's in the rose print dress there, is described in the press materials as being a biology-loving game designer. And so this game, Wandering Village, takes place in an unspecified post-apocalyptic future where the planet is subject to extreme climate variability and a nearly omnipresent threat of poisonous fungal spores that render ground and air deadly. So the game begins with a band of human stragglers finding a giant dinosaur-like beast called an onbu, on which they can build a new village, safe from the worst of the world's pollution. So in many ways, the game unfolds like a typical city builder. So you can assign tasks to villagers to farm, to build housing, gather food, lumber, and stone, and research scientific upgrades. It's pretty standard. But if you were to immerse yourself just in the city building or min-maxing, resource extraction, you would court certain failure because this city rides on the back of a living creature, one that has its own needs and feelings. So as you build, you can see Onbu, the little zoomed out view. So as you build, the Onbu continues to lumber across different biomes, exposing the village and its own body to whatever it passes through. And it has to eat, it has to sleep, but it can only do so safely in specific places. In some places, the air is so toxic and polluted that should your Onbu get tired and decide to lie down for a nap, your village will likely just die, and the Onbu itself may die. Fortunately, as the village chief, you have some options. So you can build structures that allow your people to interact with it. So you can have a feeding trebuchet that lets you lob these giant meatball-sized snacks to the Onbu's head for consumption. You can build a large horn that lets you signal to the Onbu when you want it to walk, run, swim, stop, or lay down. And then other buildings eventually allow you to administer medicine, extract blood and bile, and even just, pet the Onbu. And this last option actually proves important because Onbu is not a docile beast of burden. So it begins the game with only a little bit of trust in your command. So even a well-intentioned hornblower command may be rejected, and repeated commands may get you ignored. So if cared for, the Onbu comes to trust your direction. If mistreated, for instance, if you extract too much blood or bile, or allow parasites or spores to grow unchecked on its body, the Onbu will become upset and shake itself and destroy your village. So trust and multi-species care are at the heart of gameplay because without both, you could not carefully guide the Onbu onto different paths depending on its needs and also the villages. So there are a lot of reasons that I'm sort of obsessed with this game, even its alpha form, and it came out officially earlier this year. It's very reminiscent in its art style of the Japanese animator Hayao Miyazaki's work. If you know Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, right? Another parable of planetary toxicity. I'm also really fascinated by the game's hybridization of genres and design impulses. So if I had to describe it, Wandering Village is something like a cross between a Tamagotchi, SimCity, and The Last of Us. at least narratively. Hopefully you all want to play this now. And I think the game has a surprising amount of depth and replayability due to the difficulty settings. So this ranges from novice to veteran, and each level offers its own set of toggleable challenges like an ice age, right? And as the thermometer scale on the left indicates, while also evoking global warming or maybe the Eye of Sauron, you have to successfully survive 500 kilometers of Anbu travel at a level's max difficulty before you can play the next level. And so on the easier settings, the game is almost bucolic, right? Plenty of time to anticipate future needs and relatively forgiving encounters with the world's hostility. But by max difficulty, every decision becomes momentous, your timing has to be impeccable, and even then you still might fail. So this is my only braggy slide, sorry. But long after beating the game, right, and earning the status of a true survivor, I find myself thinking about this game's emphasis on endurance, cooperation, and mutual survival, even at the expense of individual villagers. So it gets a little dark. The village elder, you come across that didn't survive. So the typical tech tree that you get in these games has some interesting branchings in Wandering Village. So some upgrades are designed to keep Anbu happy and alive, and others more directly benefit the village. But some open up entirely different forms of social and environmental governance. So like Anbu, who has a happiness meter, the village also has a discontent meter, with angry villagers more likely to leave or to revolt. And so the tech tree allows you to keep people happy, but you can also suppress unrest with a kind of cult option in which the occasional villager is thrown by trebuchet to the Anbu as a ritual sacrifice, right? Satisfying its hunger and quelling discontent in one fell swoop. So I've never done this personally, but I'm sure you would unlock some kind of achievement when you did that. Okay, so to begin to wrap up, I just wanted to say that, I'm talking about this game partially because it's five something on day 2, but also to demonstrate the continued value of textual analysis and ecological game design. So we do risk losing something if we talk about games purely in terms of economics, politics, or logistics. And I say this even after I just recently reread my colleague Braxton Soderman's critique of flow and the playful mindset in his book, which he's talking primarily about ZeMKI. But for him, I'm not going to read the big quote, but he's saying that games have essentially been co-opted by capitalism and neoliberalism, and we make a huge mistake by assuming that play is somehow inherently subversive, right? Which I understand and agree with. So, he wants to resist the gamification and ludification of culture and steer players away from absorbing but ultimately toothless play that participates in this individualist rhetoric, right, of positive psychology or self-help. But I think we actually would both agree that part of the solution is what he would call the capacity for critical distance in games and also game scholarship. And I think that critical distance is like low poly aesthetics or an energy heads-up display, right, in terms of these are things that kind of jolt us out of the flow state or even out of playing entirely, which is a capacity that we need. So to conclude, this is actually the tiny game that gave rise to Wandering Village. Thanks. I think, we're kind of environmentally speaking at an all hands on deck point where we don't have the luxury of finding the one best option. We have to try everything. And so this includes policy, science, political reckoning, but also media and culture, including games. There is no spaceship or a mythical turtle to save us, right? And even though it'd be very easy to poke holes in the instrumentalism of things like the environmental game design playbook, which I showed you earlier, I really admire the industry and the ingenuity of the Climate SIG's members. And I've watched the SIG grow from less than a dozen people in 2020 to, at last check, when I looked at the Discord, I think they have almost 1,400 people in the Discord now. And so I'm constantly in awe of that ability. And I also find it refreshing. This reminds me of Nick's keynote earlier and the discussion of solidarity, but breaking this closed loop of academic exchange and recognizing that designers and players also have ideas and the ability to theorize and design through and around practice. And nowadays I often end up talking to pre-professional students, artists, architects, scientists from all over the place. And so, at the risk of being labeled a utopian or a naive utopian, I continue to speak up about the value of play and games, even in the face of climate precarity and the ecologically compromised nature of the industry, right, as it stands. So, I've kind of not completely answered the question of what makes a game sustainable, but I think we could at least now ask, how do a game's development and its content draw from planetary resources, and do they reciprocate in some way, creating better conditions for human and more than human life? And a few last things from Escobar, just remembering that in designing tools, we're creating ways of being, and that when we design our world designs us back. I think Escobar and also the examples I've given you of the SIG and Wandering Village show that it pays to take a humbler attitude toward design, not only in deference to the agency of players, but also to a world and material forces that may or may not be visible, but undergird our politics and our pleasures. And that would be a truly tactical response. And I'll end there. Thank you.